relaxing American bedtime story. On a quiet autumn evening in the mountains of Montana, the sky slowly turned from bright blue to soft shades of orange and purple. The cool wind whispered through the tall pine trees, carrying the fresh scent of the forest. At the edge of a peaceful lake stood a small wooden cabin. It belonged to an old man named Thomas who had lived there for many years. Every morning, he watched the sunrise with a warm cup of coffee. And every evening, he sat on the porch, listening to nature's gentle music. One Friday afternoon, Thomas's 12-year-old granddaughter Emma came to visit. She loved the cabin more than anywhere else in the world. "Grandpa," Emma smiled, "it's so quiet here." Thomas nodded gently. "That's because the forest knows how to rest," he said. "People often forget, but nature always remembers." As night slowly arrived, thousands of stars appeared across the clear American sky. The lake reflected the moon like a giant silver mirror. Thomas and Emma built a small campfire. They roasted marshmallows and wrapped themselves in warm blankets. "Do you hear that?" Thomas asked softly. Emma listened carefully. "I hear crickets, leaves, and an owl." Thomas smiled. "Exactly. The forest never becomes silent. It simply speaks more gently at night." After the fire faded into glowing embers, they walked to the end of the wooden dock. The water was perfectly still. Emma looked up. "I've never seen so many stars. In cities," Thomas said, "lights hide the stars. Out here, the sky tells its full story." For several quiet minutes, neither of them spoke. A shooting star crossed the sky. Emma closed her eyes and made a wish. "What did you wish for?" Thomas asked. She smiled. "If I tell you, it won't come true." Thomas laughed softly. "Fair enough." Soon, the cool mountain air made them sleepy. Inside the cozy cabin, a small fireplace filled the room with warmth. Emma climbed into bed beneath a thick quilt, while the gentle crackling of the fire echoed through the room. Outside, the wind continued its peaceful song among the pine trees. The moon watched over the silent forest. The lake shimmered under the starlight, and somewhere in the distance, the owl called one last time before everything became calm. Emma drifted into a peaceful sleep, dreaming of mountains, forests, sparkling lakes, and endless stars. Sometimes the greatest adventures are not the loudest ones. Sometimes the most beautiful memories are made in quiet places, beneath a sky full of stars. The next morning, Emma woke up just before sunrise. The cabin was quiet, and the air felt fresh and cool. She wrapped herself in a warm sweater and stepped onto the wooden porch. A light mist floated over the peaceful lake, making everything look like a dream. Thomas was already sitting outside with a steaming cup of coffee. "Good morning," he whispered. "Come watch the sunrise with me." Emma sat beside him without saying a word. Slowly, the first golden rays of sunlight appeared above the mountains. Birds began singing softly, and the forest seemed to wake up little by little. "It feels like the whole world is smiling," Emma said. Thomas nodded. "Every sunrise is a fresh beginning." After breakfast, they walked along a quiet forest trail. Squirrels jumped from tree to tree, while colorful leaves gently drifted down around them. Soon, they reached a small wooden bridge crossing a clear stream. Emma knelt beside the water and watched tiny fish swimming peacefully. "The water is so clear," she said. Thomas smiled. "When nature is cared for, it stays beautiful." They continued walking until they found a wide meadow filled with wildflowers. Butterflies floated through the warm morning air, and the gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of pine and flowers. Emma closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "I wish I could stay here forever." Thomas placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to stay forever," he said softly. "You only have to remember how this place makes you feel." As the afternoon passed, they returned to the cabin. That evening, they sat once again on the porch, watching the sun slowly disappear behind the mountains. The sky turned orange, then pink, then deep blue. One by one, the stars returned to the sky. Emma smiled. "I think the stars were waiting for us." Thomas looked up and quietly replied, "Maybe they were." Wrapped in warm blankets, listening to the soft sounds of the forest, they ended another peaceful day together. And under the endless American sky, the little cabin remained a place where every sunset brought peace, every sunrise brought hope, and every night carried sweet dreams. A few days passed peacefully at the little cabin. Every morning, Emma watched the sunrise. Every evening, she admired the stars. She began to notice the little things she had never paid attention to before. The sound of birds, the gentle breeze through the pine trees, and the calm ripples on the lake. On Emma's last evening before returning home, Thomas surprised her with a small gift. It was an old wooden box. Inside was a tiny compass and a handwritten note. Emma carefully unfolded the note. It read, "Whenever life feels too busy, follow your heart toward peace. The quiet places will always be waiting for you." Emma smiled as she hugged her grandfather tightly. "I'll never forget this place," she whispered. The next morning, they stood together outside the cabin one last time. The mountains glowed in the soft morning light, and the lake was as still as glass. "It's hard to say goodbye," Emma said. Thomas smiled gently. "It's never really goodbye. As long as you remember this place, a part of you will always be here." Emma took one last deep breath of the fresh mountain air before getting into the car. As they drove away, she looked back through the window. The little cabin became smaller and smaller until it disappeared among the tall pine trees. Months later, whenever life became noisy or stressful, Emma would close her eyes and remember the peaceful lake, the warm cabin, the gentle campfire, and the endless stars above the Montana mountains. Those memories always brought a smile to her face and helped her sleep peacefully. Sometimes, the greatest gift isn't something you can hold in your hands. Sometimes it's a quiet memory that stays in your heart forever. 1 year later, Emma returned to the little cabin in the Montana mountains. As soon as she stepped out of the car, the fresh pine-scented air welcomed her once again. The peaceful lake shimmered under the afternoon sun, just as she remembered. Thomas was waiting on the porch with the same warm smile. "I knew you'd come back," he said softly. Emma hugged him tightly. "I missed this place every single day." That evening, they walked to the old wooden dock together. The lake was calm and the sky slowly filled with thousands of bright stars. Emma took the small compass from the wooden box Thomas had given her the year before. "I kept it with me all this time," she said. Thomas smiled. The compass didn't just help you find places. It helped you find peace. They sat quietly, listening to the gentle sounds of the forest. No phones, no busy streets, no loud noises. Only the whisper of the wind through the pine trees. Emma closed her eyes and took a slow, deep breath. "I finally understand," she whispered. Thomas looked at her kindly. "What do you understand?" She smiled. "Happiness isn't about having more. It's about appreciating simple moments." Thomas nodded with quiet pride. Above them, a shooting star crossed the night sky, lighting the darkness for just a moment before disappearing. Emma didn't make a wish this time. She already had everything she needed. A loving grandfather, peaceful memories, and a place that would always feel like home. The little cabin stood quietly beneath the endless American sky, reminding every traveler that peace can always be found by those who slow down, look up at the stars, and listen to the gentle voice of nature. The next morning, Emma packed her bag and stood quietly on the porch of the little cabin. The cool mountain breeze gently moved through the pine trees, and the peaceful lake reflected the golden morning sunlight. Before leaving, she hugged her grandfather tightly. "Thank you for showing me a place where my heart can truly rest," she said with a smile. Thomas gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "Whenever life becomes too busy, remember this cabin, these mountains, and the stars above. Peace is never far away if you know where to look." As the car slowly drove down the winding mountain road, Emma looked back one last time. The little wooden cabin disappeared behind the tall trees, but its warmth remained in her heart. Months and even years passed. Life became busy again. But whenever Emma felt tired or worried, she would close her eyes and remember the quiet lake, the crackling campfire, the gentle forest breeze, and the endless stars over the Montana mountains. Those beautiful memories always filled her heart with peace and reminded her that happiness isn't found in having more. It is found in slowing down, appreciating nature, and spending time with the people we love. And somewhere beneath the same star-filled sky, the little cabin continued to stand quietly, waiting to welcome Emma home again someday.